To share this with us. I want to thank the panel, Sergio Sarmiento.
Very good. You're learning Spanish.
I'm not doing too well. Alec, I'm trying to come up with a Spanish pronunciation of Alec Ross. Alejandro Ross. And Ricardo Salinas, thank you for sharing this moment with us. Amy Garmer for writing it, and all of you for participating. We can continue this conversation on Twitter at hashtag freedom with the number 2 and C. So freedom to connect, freedom to see. We'll see you there. Our ambassador, he's already tweeted. He's Mr. Tweeting diplomat. But thank you all, and we'll go on to Mexico. Thank you.
What's going to motivate them. But let me tell you something that happens in Mexico. We have no re-election of legislators or mayors or governors or the president. I believe having no re-election for the president is great. I wouldn't like to have an Hugo Chavez that stays for forever. But I think the non-re-election issue in our Constitution has actually hurt us a lot, especially for legislators. If you legislators have no motivation to actually improve the life of society because they owe their jobs and they owe their sinecuraries to the political party heads. If we had re-election of legislators, there would be a motivation to actually improve all kinds of legislation, all kinds of law, because deputies, which are representatives, and our senators would need to come up with ideas and legislation that actually help people. At this point, what I have found in the past is that every time you try to push freedoms a bit further in Mexico, and freedom of information is one of them, basically governments are always reluctant. Then eventually, when they have no choice, they actually accept it, and then they claim that it was their initiative. That happened to me with President Vicente Fox, who once told me at a meal that all of this issue about freedom of expression, especially freedom of information, the Freedom of Information Act, was something crazy that some journalists had come up with. And when actually the legislation was enacted, he went all over the country claiming that this was an issue that he had supported from the start. If we do get re-election, at least for deputies and senators, for our legislators, I do believe that there would be a greater incentive for them to actually promote measures like freedom of information, or like having, not having these legislation that we have right now, electoral legislation that actually prevents people from expressing themselves in the media, because politicians wouldn't be able to defend those things because they would want to be re-elected. Right now, they know that they're going to be, after 3 years, they're out of their position. And so they have no incentive to actually have a system that would allow them, for example, to be critical of the government if they're in the opposition, because they know that they're not elected because they went to the people for their vote. They were elected because they went to a political party chief who decided who was going to occupy the various positions, and then people just go there and vote for the name of a party, but they don't know who they're electing. So in order to align the incentives properly, I would push for re-election of legislators. I think it would help the country a lot.
And in the face of everything Sergio is describing about the lack of incentives within the political structures, when I talk to governments and try to persuade them towards more openness, what tends to persuade them is less the value and virtue of free expression and more economic well-being. In 1991, the per capita GDP in Belarus and Estonia were roughly the same. There were bread lines in Estonia, there were bread lines in Belarus. One took a closed model, one took a more open model in terms of its political development, in terms of the development of communications there. Today, Estonia is flourishing, it's wealthy, and it's helping to lead Europe, and Belarus is Belarus. So part of what I believe is that you want people to do these things for the right reason, but one of the right reasons to highlight most is economic well-being, and to draw a line between openness, innovation, bandwidth abundance, and economic well-being.
So connectivity. Oh.
And if I may add to close,
Sure.
I don't think it's only just the concept of freedom of information, but the general concept of freedom that needs to be promoted more, and that's why we started Caminos de la Libertad. Sometimes we just take it for granted until we lose it. So it's a thing that needs to be ingrained in our new generations. It needs to be taught in school, it needs to be discussed, and needs to be analyzed to see how is it that we lose freedom. Because how we lose freedom is normally not in one blow. This is the gradualism of the little frog in the hot water, right? Where it sort of gets a little warmer and warmer and it hard boils. But if you throw a frog into boiling water, it jumps out. So the way that we've been losing our freedoms has been gradually, and mostly in the interest of security, right? So security is a big thing here against our freedoms. And I think that's unfortunately something that's a worldwide phenomenon. We need to be alert against that. We need to be aware, and we need to be sure that these ideas that are important are being transmitted to the younger generations, and so they have a place to live in. At least that's my thought.
So let me just recap that this report and project.
What they could do is, follow accounting rules. The accounting system of the government is terrible. I'm not sure about the U.S. government, probably the same. But in the Mexican case, it's just inflows and outflows. There's no concept of a balance sheet, no concept of assets, no concept of deferred liabilities. I mean, it's really the most rudimentary system ever. And of course, when you don't have a good information system, you don't have the information to make the good decisions. So, in the Mexican budget system, it's exactly the same to build a road as to hire 1,000 workers and make them dig a ditch. It's exactly the same accounting effect. So, access to information is good, but we also need to review the system. Now, the question about content, I'm using this phrase that a friend of mine gave me. Content is king and distribution is queen, and they live in the castle of technology. So I thought that was pretty neat. It's not mine, somebody gave it to me. But yeah, content is of course the most important thing. The way you distribute it used to be for us over-the-air television, free broadcast television. Now of course that is changing. We have to consider that the content will be consumed in the very small screen of the mobile terminal, or in the bigger screen of the pad, or the bigger screen of the computer, or the big screen of the home. And it can be consumed at different times if you have the right distribution system, which is a big if. Not everybody has access, or all content has access to that. And of course, technology is changing all that very soon. It used to be that it was very difficult to have speedy wireless access on the mobile terminals. Now I'm glad to be in Washington. I can see that my iPhone actually works, and I can open the screen, with AT&T. It didn't used to be like that, not many months ago. So this is constantly improving, and the capacity we have to distribute and consume content will be, of course, improving and improving and improving every day through the development of technology.
Last question over here.
To the federal government, that's a major issue. We've learned that most of the graft and most of the problems with corruption in Mexico actually go in the state and local governments. There's a proposal by President-elect Enrique Peña Nieto to actually expand the Freedom of Information Act to the local governments. Instead of having 32 legislations throughout the country. We would have only one legislation, and every state would have to abide, and every municipality would have to abide by the same legislation. I think it's a very sensible proposal. So I'm supporting publicly that proposal. You know, that's insofar as data is concerned.
And by the way, it's a really good idea, but I think it's missing a critical part, which is
GDP comes from companies that did not exist 30 years ago.
wow.
And what's interesting now is that as we increasingly move from an industrial age to an information age, the great economic powers of the future are going to be those who, in 20 to 30 years, have 30 to 40% of their economy made up by companies that do not exist today. And so at the heart of your question, I think, is a very important point, because what you've got to be able to do is take that creativity and that spark of innovation and commercialize it and bring it to market. So there's macroeconomic consequence to the underlying question.
Culture of innovation.
That's right.
Yeah.
Over here.
It's
And
a
I'm
very
sorry
good
about the
question.
confusion on the name. I'm sorry.
It's a very good question, and you know, the thing about creativity and innovation is it doesn't all have to be, you know, with a white robe in a laboratory with a scientist. There's many ways to innovate and to create. Just taking the essence of one thing and putting it together with another. That's another way to create. I think Jobs has a good paragraph about that in his book. We create by taking the best ideas from around the world and putting it with some of our good ideas, putting them together to work. So we have some pretty original technological developments. We have more than 1,500 people working in our IT department. We process, as I said, almost 30 million customers daily through their operations, you know, in a very advanced way with data centers. We have biometric identification for a customer. Our bank customers show themselves at the counter. They have a camera and a fingerprint like the border thing, and we know exactly who they are. And the ID is a secondary thing. We're now working on face recognition and voice print recognitions to make it even faster and better. That's the kind of thing that allows us, for example, not to charge any commissions. Our banks don't charge any fees at all. We don't charge a single fee for anything.
Make money?
Yeah, we make money the old-fashioned way, loaning it and collecting it, which is what banks used to do, right? I mean, you take good people, identify them, get good projects, and then give them some money, and then they pay you back with interest. That's the way our bank works, and we don't charge any fees. Yeah, we make a lot of money.
Let me speak to that question too in a broader context for just a moment. In the United States,
I would have lived in a democratic country 20 years longer. Because you're quite right, it was communication that in the end broke the mold, which broke down the Iron Curtain, which tore down the Iron Curtain. So I just want to say that what you are discussing has an enormous significance internationally. Now I just want to add something else. We at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, we're engaged in a project called the Atlantic Basin Initiative. What you are talking about fits exactly into that mold. What we're talking about is that there's this talk about the pivot to Asia. And by the way, the great ideas for democracy and media freedom and human rights are starting to emerge from corners of the world that were not supposed to represent all these values.
We would be more aware of spending patterns by governments. One of the biggest issues in Mexico right now is that we've managed to control spending by the federal government, but it is mushrooming at the state and local levels. We would have a country in which children and teenagers would be able to learn more, would be better prepared to face the world. It wouldn't be nirvana, no, because there are no magic wands that can actually solve the problems of a country, but it would certainly be a much better country.
Let's go to the next.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that.
While we don't view internet access as a human right, what we do believe is that internet freedom is the first sort of distinctly human rights agenda of the 21st century. If you believe in the freedom of association and assembly, if you believe in free expression, if you believe in a free press, if you believe in any of these rights and any of these freedoms, in the year 2012, you have to believe in them in the internet. And so one of Hillary Clinton's, I think, signature initiatives since becoming Secretary of State is to recognize the degree to which being able to freely connect to the internet and to the websites of one's choosing and to each other is going to be an enabler not just of political rights but of economic rights. You know, when she did so, she launched this initiative on January 21st of 2010. At the time, it was sort of edgy when she did this. They said, you know, look at Hillary Clinton getting way out there ahead on internet issues. Today, I think it shows her prescience as our economies have developed in certain ways, as political movements have been increasingly propelled by internet access and other such things. And so if you aren't a part of the connected world, then you're truly disconnected politically and you're disconnected economically. Right. And so I think that part of what Hillary Clinton has done here as a matter of global leadership, I think is very important, and I hope, you know, particularly as her tenure concludes, that an increasing number of leaders around the world will pick up the mantle that she set out.
What would Mexico look like with, you know, right now it's 30.
High-speed internet allows for a tremendous growth in human development and human capital, because you could have the very best professor of whatever subject be there talking to you, delivering the absolute best lecture. You could have the best tour of, I don't know, the Roman ruins in multimedia, and you'd have a better experience than actually going and visiting there. So the capacity to develop the human mind and the spirit in all different kinds of areas is clearly there. I think it's going to open up a huge new paradox for education, you know. But I don't know.
The only thing that I would add to this, and this is based more on my experience of helping lead an NGO for 8 years that was focused on this issue more so than my experience in government, is that you actually don't need to be terribly paternalistic about this. You know, people who are young and poor are still like fish in water when it comes to the internet. And if you actually look at the data, sort of traditionally the way in which people are most comfortable with and have the highest level of acuity for the use of these tools has less to do with household income and more to do with age. And so there's this great asset that can be leveraged in youth, which are, you know, people under 30 who they may not be accessing high-speed internet connections at their home right now, but they probably are doing so at internet cafes or other such places. So even when I'm in some of the poorest places in the world, it's fascinating to me to see how these young people take so quickly to the technology. So what I would not do as government is take a deterministic view that says, all right, we will, you know, help facilitate this infrastructure development, but before doing so, you know, we must put, you know, these 14 programs in place to make sure people know how to use it. I think the greatest accelerant for a digital culture, frankly, are people who are under the age of 30. And I do not think it is too much to say that if you build it, they will come. It's proven out time and time again around the world where connectivity has been newly introduced.
But for that connectivity to actually be taken into account, you need to have access to computers and access to wideband to high-speed internet. In Mexico, the Secretariat of Public Education spent a fortune actually connecting some big blackboards that the teachers tried to use that couldn't use, and that the students weren't allowed to use. There are other projects that have actually considered the possibility of taking laptops to every child. There's a program by MIT which I think has been quite successful, where it has been experimented, including a couple of states in Mexico. And the difference is amazing. But of course, to be able to have those, you have to have access to the internet, and that's why it's so important to break the monopolies and to be able to have access. And I think it has to be an open-ended infrastructure. It shouldn't be a government network that doesn't allow any kind of connectivity with the systems that we use commercially. That's why it's so important to break the monopolies.
I would just add one thing to that. even now, our Mexican government has started a new initiative to put laptops into the hands of the people with a subsidized program. But, you know, I think, again, they're totally behind. They're missing the point here. Because computers are no longer those laptops. They're the tablets. Totally missed it here, yeah. And they'd be putting up in the access, because the absolutely critical thing is the access. Maybe you don't notice it so much because you live in this society. But if you go to Mexico or to Latin America, internet access is a real issue. And it's not the same thing to go to an internet cafe and send in mail as to be, you know, sit around in your home and mess around with the tablet. It's a totally different experience that leads to totally different results, I think, in terms of human capital. Great.
Thank you. Hector Chamis from Georgia.
This new information economy.
So in the report, we talk about basically, I think there's a need for information literacy, or, you know, an economy. So in this milieu of the Mexican economy growing now and sort of starting to take off, but this communications sector kind of lagging behind, how do you see that leapfrog? What's your vision for the communications world of Mexico tomorrow?
Well, the government has to play a major role. One of the important things is that we don't realize, but, you know, if a government builds an airport or a road or a dock or a port, that's okay. But why are they not putting fiber optics all over the place? It's the most important infrastructure. That's being left to private investment. Not that private investment is bad, you know, like a private port or a private airport, but it's not going to be sufficient. In that respect, I have to point out this very successful program the Colombian government initiated to connect the most remote municipalities with fiber optics. And what they did was really creative. They said, okay, this is a valuable infrastructure we wanted, but the market is not going to be there. I mean, it's going to be in Bogota and Medellin and all those other places because there's money there. But, you know, a municipality out in the jungle, no way. So they said, we're going to put $220 million in this pot, and then we're going to auction this money to the company that gives us the most municipalities covered with fiber optic, connected with fiber optic. And so we competed in that, and we actually won. We only won by 13 municipalities. But it was like 460 against 450. So it was a quite close thing. And now, within the next 2 years, we'll be connecting 460 municipalities that had no way that they could get fiber optics through this special government incentive, which, by the way, we get to keep after 17 years if we deliver the service on time, as promised, with the free connectivity to the police and the library and the school and this and that. And we get to keep that after 17 years. So I thought that was a really creative model to get ahead. But, you know, one of the things that Colombia has is they have a Ministry of Technology and Information and Communications. In Mexico, we have something called the Communications Ministry, which builds roads, airports, ports, ferrocarriles, railroads. Yeah, the information part is an undersecretary that's always fighting with the COFETEL. So we need a new structure that focuses the issue on having connectivity. Now, connectivity is two types, fiber and wireless. Wireless, the private companies are doing a pretty good job in the urban areas, but not in the rural areas for exactly the same reason. I mean, it's just not profitable to go and set up all this equipment in the middle of the jungle or wherever, where there's less demand, but doesn't make it less necessary for those people. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, we're not using telephones anymore. Those things are computers. They're very powerful computers. Those tablets there, those iPhones are extremely powerful computers. When you connect them over the wireless cloud, you arrive at nirvana, which is the information age. Right? So, obviously, in some aspects, the private sector is going to do it, But the government should really consider this infrastructure as something most necessary for the development of the country.
Anybody want to ask our charge at the State Department with looking at the entire world and looking at 21st century statecraft? Maybe you could put a little put this report and this approach in context to the
Sure. Well, I'll speak just very briefly because I think Mr. Salinas and Sergio made some very good points that are universal in nature. What I'd say is that iron was the raw material of the industrial age, and data is the raw material of the information age. And as I've traveled to more than 70 countries over the last 3 years and spoken to government officials and business leaders around the world, they're all asking themselves, how do we make this pivot from having an industrial age economy to an information age economy? And it's quite simple that if you live in an environment where bandwidth is scarce and expensive, then you are going to not be able to compete and succeed to the degree to which your global competitors are. Mexico is no longer merely competing with Canada, the United States, or Colombia. It's competing now with India, it's competing with Brazil, it's competing with China. It's a truly global marketplace that we live and work in now. So I think that the challenge to Mexico is the challenge that most of the rest of the world, including the United States, has, which is to figure out how to make our business environment, how to make our academic environments as data rich, as information abundant as possible. I don't think anybody hearing just that would object to that. But then come politics. And so I'll make a point about sort of the political context into which all of this falls. If the principal binary construct for political disagreements in the 20th century was left versus right, in the 21st century, it's open versus closed. And so again, as I've traveled around the world, this is not something that is Mexico specific, but as I've traveled around the world, presidents, prime ministers, princes alike are all grappling with, in a world that is increasingly made more open and more transparent by connectivity, how do you still have some measure of control? What controls do you put in place? And my response to that is the 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak. And it's quite important in this environment for government to play a role as a facilitator of innovation and to lend itself to as much openness and innovation as possible.
Well, let's go to the culture of innovation then,
sure,
that you suggested in the conference.
Sure. So, I do think that it's important oftentimes not merely to talk about legal or structural barriers to innovation, but also to talk about something that's almost impolite to talk about aloud in these kinds of settings, which is the issue of culture. And again, some of the thoughts that I have here are not Mexico specific, but they're universal in nature. And I'll point to sort of three things that I think are necessary for any society to truly have an environment that lends itself to innovation. The first is to value the perspectives and to frankly invest in youth. I'm 40 years old, and what's interesting about being 40 in my job is that I'm oftentimes either the youngest person sort of at the table in a foreign policy settings, but then when I'm in Silicon Valley and when I'm with the people who are doing some of the most interesting and innovative stuff, I oftentimes am the oldest person. And I think it's very important to build a bridge between our leaders, our business and political leaders, and these young people, because a lot of the innovation and assets that are being developed by people who are growing up digital. It's not a surprise that Facebook, for example, was created by a student at Harvard who didn't have an undergraduate degree yet. Google was invented by two young guys who hadn't been employed before, who were graduate students. And there are, dozens more lesser-known examples of this. And I think it's important not just to give these young people a seat at the table, but recognize that you actually have to invest in them, and recognize that to bring a point of inspiration to commercialization, it actually takes capital. And this goes to my second point, which is to understand and accept that you've got to have an increased toleration for risk and for failure in any society that's going to be truly innovative. A lot of what I think distinguishes societies that do produce a lot of innovation and a lot of the wealth that accrues to that is a place that does not over-punish failure. You know, Steve Jobs would never have gotten another shot at Apple after being fired the first time from Apple and then, you know, not succeeding by most measures at Next Computer. You know, Eric Schmidt, who became the very successful chairman and CEO of Google, would not have gotten that job in most societies, having not beaten Microsoft previously as the CEO at Novell. And so I think part of what we've got to do is understand that the learning that comes from failure and to increase our threshold for risk. And that manifests itself in my third point, which is about access to high-risk early-stage capital. In places where there is a willingness to invest aggressively and where there are well-developed venture capital sectors, you're more often than not going to see the benefit in terms of the job growth and the economic growth. But that then involves creating some policy levers and some financial incentives to drive more capital, to drive higher risk capital into high risk early stage investing. And so I think that all of these things play into what are ultimately cultural factors that, that are necessary to accelerate innovation.
Great. We're going to, in a minute, take questions from the audience or